I pulled a juvenile Bigfoot out of a frozen river on January 6, 1978. It was dying. I could see it in the way its chest barely moved, the way its fingers had gone stiff and blue-gray beneath the matted fur. I was 29 years old, standing knee-deep in the Clearwater River in central Idaho, and I made a decision in that moment that would define the next 47 years of my life. Because 3 weeks later, that creature came back. And what it brought me, what it placed at my feet with hands still too young to be steady, was something that shattered every assumption I had ever held about what these beings are, what they understand, and what they have been hiding from us since before recorded history. My name is Earl Covington. I am 76 years old. I was born and raised in Orofino, Idaho, a logging town of about 3,000 people that sits along the banks of the Clearwater River at the western edge of the Bitterroot Mountains. My father, Russell Covington, was a timber faller for Potlatch Corporation. His father before him had done the same work. The Covingtons had been in those mountains since 1906, when my great-grandfather came west from Kentucky, chasing timber wages and never left. I grew up in the woods the way most boys in Orofino did. By the time I was 12, I could track a bull elk through 3 inches of fresh snow. By 16, I could drop a mule deer at 200 yards with my father's old Remington 700. I knew these forests the way a sailor knows his coastline, not from maps but from muscle memory, from the smell of Douglas fir sap on a warm afternoon, from the way the wind sounded different when it came through cedar versus hemlock, from the particular silence that meant a storm was building behind the Selway Crags. After high school, I went to work for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game as a seasonal wildlife technician. By 1974, I had earned a permanent position as a conservation officer, what most people called a game warden. My territory covered roughly 600 square miles of some of the most remote wilderness in the lower 48 states. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness alone was over 1 million acres of roadless country where you could walk for a week without crossing a single man-made structure. I loved that job. I loved the solitude, the responsibility, the feeling that I was doing something that mattered. I enforced hunting regulations, monitored wildlife populations, assisted search and rescue operations, and occasionally dealt with poachers who thought the backcountry was beyond the reach of the law. I was good at what I did, and by 29 I had developed a reputation as someone who could handle anything the Idaho wilderness threw at him. I was wrong about that, because nothing in my training, nothing in my experience, nothing in any manual or protocol I had ever studied prepared me for what happened on that frozen January morning in 1978. The winter of 77 into 78 was brutal, even by Idaho standards. Temperatures in the Clearwater drainage had dropped below zero for 19 consecutive days in December, and the snow in the high country was already at 140% of normal. The river itself was running low and cold, choked with ice shelves along the banks that extended 15 or 20 feet out from shore. In the deeper channels, the water still moved, black and fast, and so cold it could kill a man in minutes. I was on patrol that morning, driving my department-issued 1976 Ford Bronco along a Forest Service road about 12 miles northeast of Orofino. The road followed the North Fork of the Clearwater through a narrow canyon where the mountains pressed in close on both sides. It was early, maybe 7:15, and the sun hadn't cleared the ridgeline yet. The thermometer on my dash read 11 below zero. My breath fogged against the windshield, despite the heater running full blast. I had been checking on a series of elk feeding stations the department had set up to help the herds through the hard winter. The stations were simple affairs, just wooden troughs filled with alfalfa hay and grain pellets, placed at intervals along the river corridor where elk congregated during deep snow years. My job was to refill them, check for signs of predator activity, and document the condition of the herds. I had just finished restocking the third station and was driving to the fourth when I saw something on the river that made me stop the Bronco in the middle of the road. About 80 yards downstream from a tight bend where the current pushed against a rock outcropping, something was in the water. Not floating, not moving with the current, struggling. I could see splashing, irregular and desperate, the kind of thrashing that meant something alive was fighting to stay that way. My first thought was elk. Elk sometimes broke through ice shelves trying to cross rivers in winter, especially young animals that didn't know the ice wouldn't hold them. I had pulled 3 elk out of the Clearwater the previous winter using ropes and my truck winch. It was dangerous work, but it was part of the job. I grabbed my binoculars from the passenger seat and brought them to my eyes. What I saw through those lenses made my hands go still. It wasn't an elk. It was dark, almost black against the gray ice and white snow. It was upright, or trying to be, its upper body above the waterline while its lower half was submerged in the current. And it had arms, not forelegs, arms. Long, muscular arms that were gripping the edge of the ice shelf, trying to pull itself out of the water. But the ice kept breaking under its weight, sending it back into the current each time it made progress. I lowered the binoculars. My heart was hammering. I told myself it was a bear, a black bear that had come out of hibernation too early, disoriented, stumbled into the river. It happened sometimes. Bears woke up in midwinter if their dens were disturbed or if they hadn't put on enough fat in the fall. A bear in the river in January, that made sense. That was something I could explain. I raised the binoculars again. The creature had managed to get one arm fully onto the ice shelf and was pulling with everything it had. I could see the muscles bunching under the wet fur, could see the raw effort in every movement. And then it turned its head toward the bank, toward me, and I saw its face. It was not a bear. The face was flat, wide, with a heavy brow ridge and a broad nose. The mouth was open, gasping, and I could see teeth that were blunt and squared, not the pointed canines of a bear. The eyes were set forward, not on the sides of the head like a prey animal, but facing straight ahead like a human's, like mine. And it was small. Not small by human standards, but small compared to what I would later understand these creatures could be. Maybe 5 feet tall, 5.5 at most. Its proportions were wrong for an adult of any species I knew. The limbs were slightly too long for the torso, the way a teenager's are when they hit a growth spurt, and their body hasn't caught up to its own frame. This was a juvenile, a child. I don't remember making a conscious decision. I don't remember thinking through the options, weighing the risks, considering what I was about to do. I just moved. I threw the Bronco into park, grabbed the tow rope from behind the seat, and started running toward the river. The bank was steep, maybe a 12-foot drop to the ice shelf below. I half climbed, half slid down, my boots punching through the crusty snow. The cold hit me like a wall the moment I left the shelter of the road. 11 below zero with a wind chill that must have been pushing 30 below. My eyes watered immediately, and the moisture froze on my eyelashes. I reached the ice shelf and tested it with my weight. Solid. At least near the bank where it was thick, probably 8 or 10 inches, but I could see where it thinned toward the open channel, could see the dark water moving beneath the translucent edges. That was where the creature was, right at the boundary between solid ice and the killing cold of the river. I got down on my belly, distributed my weight, started crawling toward the creature, paying out the rope behind me with one end tied to a boulder on the bank. If the ice gave way under me, the rope was my lifeline. The creature saw me coming. Its eyes went wide, and it made a sound I will never forget as long as I live. Not a growl, not a scream, but something between a whimper and a moan, a sound of absolute terror mixed with exhaustion. It was afraid of me. Even as it was dying in that frozen river, it was more afraid of me than it was of the water. "Easy," I said, though my voice came out as a croak in the frigid air. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm trying to help." I know how that sounds, talking to it like it was a frightened dog or a spooked horse. But what else do you do when you're crawling across ice towards something that shouldn't exist? Something that is looking at you with eyes that hold too much intelligence for comfort. I got within 10 feet and stopped. The creature had managed to get both arms onto the ice, but its lower body was still in the water, and I could see it was weakening. The movements were slower now, less coordinated. Hypothermia was setting in. In water that cold, even with a layer of fur, a body that size might have 20 minutes before the core temperature dropped low enough to cause cardiac arrest. Maybe less for a juvenile whose body mass was lower. I fashioned a loop in the rope and slid it across the ice toward the creature. It flinched when the rope touched its arm, pulled back, nearly lost its grip on the ice edge. "No, no, no," I said quickly. "It's a rope. Grab it. Hold on to it and I can pull you out. I need you to grab the rope. Can you understand me? Grab the rope." The creature looked at the rope, then at me, and I saw something shift in its expression. Not comprehension exactly, but a calculation. It was weighing its options. Stay in the water and die, or trust the human and maybe live. I could almost see the thought process happening in real time, and that alone told me more about what I was dealing with than any physical description ever could. It grabbed the rope. The grip was strong despite the hypothermia. I felt the line go taut and immediately started pulling, backing up on my belly, hauling with everything I had. The creature helped, using its arms to push and pull itself forward onto the ice. There was a terrible moment when the ice cracked under the combined stress, a sound like a gunshot echoing off the canyon walls, and I thought we were both going in, but the fracture held. The ice bent but didn't break, and inch by inch, the creature came out of the water. When it was fully on the ice shelf, I kept pulling, dragging it toward the thicker ice near the bank. It was limp now, barely conscious. The fur on its lower body was soaked and already starting to freeze in the air, forming a crust of ice crystals that crackled as I moved it. The skin underneath was grayish, the color of something losing circulation. I got it to the base of the bank and wrapped the rope around my waist. Getting it up the 12-foot embankment was the hardest physical thing I have ever done. The creature weighed probably 160, maybe 180 pounds. Wet, with ice forming on its fur, it felt like twice that. I pulled and climbed and slipped and pulled again, my boots digging into the frozen earth, my arms burning, my lungs aching from the cold air. When I finally got it to the road, I was shaking from exertion and cold. I dragged it to the Bronco, opened the back, and somehow wrestled it inside. I cranked the heater to maximum and pointed every vent I could at the creature. Then I stripped off my coat and covered it, adding my emergency wool blanket from the survival kit behind the driver's seat. The creature was unconscious now, breathing in shallow, irregular gasps. Its lips, if you could call them that, were blue. The hands, God, the hands were the most disturbing thing. They were so human. 5 fingers, an opposable thumb, fingernails instead of claws. They were larger than mine, thicker, with heavy calluses on the palms, but the basic structure was unmistakably human. Those hands were curled against its chest like a child's, and the fingers had gone the color of old wax. I drove. I didn't think about where I was going or what I was doing. I just drove, pushing the Bronco as fast as I dared on the icy road, heading back toward my cabin, not toward town, not toward the Fish and Game office, not toward a veterinarian or a hospital or anyone who might be able to help. Toward my cabin, 12 miles south of Orofino, where I lived alone on 40 acres of timberland that bordered the national forest. Why? Because even in that moment of pure adrenaline and panic, Some part of my brain understood what would happen if I brought this creature to town. The circus that would descend, the scientists, the government agents, the media, the hunters who would want to bag one of their own. I had spent 5 years in these mountains. I had heard the stories from the old-timers, the Nez Perce elders who spoke of the Stick Indians, the creatures of the deep forest. I had dismissed those stories the way most young men dismiss the wisdom of their elders, with polite nods and private skepticism. But I had also heard other stories, whispered ones, about government trucks in the backcountry, about helicopters flying at night in areas where no helicopter should be, about things that went unreported and unexplained and got buried under layers of bureaucratic silence. Whatever this creature was, I knew instinctively that bringing it to the attention of authorities would not end well for it. So I took it home. My cabin was small, maybe 800 square feet, built of logs my father and I had cut and milled ourselves in 1971. 1 bedroom, a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bathroom I had added in '73 when I got tired of using the outhouse in winter. A wood stove provided heat, and I kept it burning around the clock from November through March. I carried the creature inside, which was easier said than done. Even unconscious and hypothermic, it was dead weight and awkward. I laid it on the floor in front of the wood stove, on top of every blanket and sleeping bag I owned. Then I stoked the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, stripped the ice-crusted fur as best I could with towels, and began the slow process of trying to warm it up. I knew the basics of treating hypothermia from my search and rescue training. Warm the core first. Don't rub the extremities because that pushes cold blood back to the heart. Warm fluids if the patient is conscious. Insulate from the ground. Remove wet clothing, though in this case the clothing was its own fur, and I couldn't exactly remove that. For the next 3 hours, I did everything I could. I heated water and soaked towels in it, placing them against the creature's chest and abdomen. I kept the fire roaring. I talked to it, partly because I had read that unconscious patients sometimes respond to voice, and partly because the silence of that cabin, with an impossible creature on my floor, was more than I could bear. "Come on," I said, rubbing its chest gently through a warm towel. "Come on, kid. You didn't fight that hard in the river just to die on my floor. Wake up. Stay with me." Around 10:30 that morning, the creature's breathing changed. It deepened, became more regular. The color in its face shifted from gray to something warmer, a ruddy brown beneath the dark hair, and then its eyes opened. I was kneeling right beside it, replacing a cooling towel with a freshly warmed one, and suddenly I was looking directly into a pair of eyes that were the color of dark honey. Not brown exactly, not amber, but something in between, shot through with flecks of gold that caught the firelight. The pupil was large, dilated from the ordeal, and the intelligence behind it was immediate and undeniable. We stared at each other. The creature's eyes moved over my face, studying me with an intensity that felt almost physical. I could see fear there, confusion, pain, and one thing more: recognition. Not of me specifically, but of what I was. It knew I was human. It knew what humans were. And whatever it knew about us, it was not reassuring. "It's okay," I said softly, keeping my hands visible and still. "You're safe. You fell in the river and I pulled you out. You're in my cabin. You're warm. You're going to be all right." The creature tried to move and immediately let out a sound of pain, sharp, involuntary, almost like a bark. It grabbed its right leg and I could see the problem. The ankle was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin beneath the fur tight and discolored. It must have happened in the river, caught on a rock, or twisted against the ice shelf during its struggle. "That's hurt," I said unnecessarily. "Might be broken. Let me look at it." I reached slowly toward the injured ankle, telegraphing every movement. The creature tensed, its whole body going rigid, those honey-colored eyes locked on my hands. but it didn't pull away. It let me touch the ankle, let me feel gently around the swollen joint. Not broken, I concluded after careful examination. Badly sprained, though, possibly a hairline fracture. I can wrap it, but you're going to need to stay off it for a while. The creature was watching my face while I spoke, and I could see it processing. Not just the tone of my voice, but the words themselves. The way its eyes tracked my lip movements. The way its head tilted slightly when I used a word it seemed to recognize. This was not an animal trying to determine if I was a threat. This was a being trying to understand what I was saying. I got up and went to the bathroom, returning with my first aid kit. I had an ace bandage, some aspirin, and a tube of Bengay. Not exactly a hospital, but it was what I had. I wrapped the ankle carefully, watching the creature's face for signs of pain. It winced when I tightened the bandage, but made no move to stop me. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and really looked at it for the first time. In the full light of the cabin, with the fire crackling and the morning sun filtering through the windows, it was both more and less frightening than it had been in the river. Less because it was clearly young and injured and vulnerable, more because the intelligence in those eyes was impossible to deny or dismiss. The face was broad with prominent cheekbones and a heavy brow ridge that cast the eyes into slight shadow. The nose was flat and wide with large nostrils. The jaw was strong but not protruding, more human than ape. The hair covered almost everything, dark brown with lighter patches on the chest and the inner arms, but the face itself had thinner coverage, almost like a very heavy beard on a human, allowing me to see the skin beneath. That skin was dark, somewhere between olive and deep brown, and it had the texture of old leather, thick and weathered. The body was stocky but not fat. Even as a juvenile, the muscle definition was impressive. Heavy shoulders, thick forearms, a chest that was barrel-shaped and powerful. The feet were enormous compared to the body, easily 14 inches long, with toes that were longer and more flexible than human toes, almost like a second set of fingers. But it was the hands that kept drawing my attention. Those human hands with their calloused palms and blunt fingernails. One of them was resting on its chest, rising and falling with each breath. The other was wrapped around its injured ankle, the fingers curved protectively over the bandage I had applied. "Are you hungry?" I asked, because I didn't know what else to say and because feeding something seemed like the most universal gesture of goodwill I could think of. The creature's eyes shifted toward my kitchen area. It sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, and I realized its sense of smell was probably extraordinary. It could probably catalog every item of food in my cabin from where it lay. I got up and went to the kitchen. I had venison in the freezer, canned vegetables, bread, apples, a bag of mixed nuts I had bought at the Safeway in Orofino. I pulled out some of each, arranging them on a plate. The venison was frozen solid, so I set it near the stove to thaw and brought the rest over. The creature eyed the plate warily. I picked up an apple and took a bite, the oldest trick in the book. See? Safe. Food. You can eat it. I set the apple down on the plate and pushed it closer. The creature reached out with one long arm and picked up a handful of the mixed nuts. It brought them to its nose first, sniffing carefully, then placed one in its mouth and chewed slowly, then another, then the rest of the handful. It picked up the apple I had bitten, smelled it, and ate it in 3 bites, core and all. Within 10 minutes, everything on the plate was gone. The creature looked at me, looked at the kitchen area, then back at me. The message was clear. More. Over the next 3 days, the creature stayed in my cabin. I called in sick to work, telling my supervisor I had a stomach flu, which was the first time in 5 years I had missed a day. I spent those 3 days doing 3 things: feeding it, tending to its ankle, and trying to establish some form of communication. The feeding was simple but expensive. The creature ate constantly and in quantities that stunned me. In a single day, it consumed 4 pounds of venison, 2 pounds of apples, a loaf of bread, a full bag of mixed nuts, 3 cans of green beans, and most of a jar of peanut butter that it ate with its fingers directly from the jar. I had to make 2 trips to the grocery store in town, buying food in quantities that must have raised eyebrows. I told the cashier at Safeway I was stocking up for a long winter, which wasn't exactly a lie. The ankle improved rapidly. By the second day, the swelling had decreased significantly, and the creature could put some weight on it. By the third day, it was walking with only a slight limp. Whatever these creatures were, they healed fast, faster than any animal I had ever worked with. But it was the communication that fascinated me most. The creature was learning, actively, deliberately learning. On the first day, it watched everything I did with those intense honey-colored eyes, tracking my movements around the cabin, studying the objects I used, listening to the words I spoke. By the second day, it had begun to mimic. Not words, its vocal anatomy couldn't produce human speech, but gestures. When I pointed at the stove and said warm, it would later point at the stove when it wanted me to add wood to the fire. When I touched my stomach and said hungry, it would touch its own stomach to tell me it wanted food. By the third day, we had a vocabulary of maybe 15 gestures: hungry, thirsty, warm, cold, pain, sleep, outside. Yes, a nod it had picked up immediately, and no, a head shake it learned just as fast. It was the most remarkable display of learning I had ever witnessed. Not just imitation, but comprehension. It understood context, understood that gestures could represent abstract concepts, understood that communication with me required a shared system of meaning. On the morning of the 4th day, January 10th, I woke up to find the creature standing at my cabin door. It was testing the handle, turning it back and forth with those enormous hands, trying to figure out the mechanism. When it heard me sit up in bed, it turned and looked at me. Then it pointed at the door, pointed at itself, and gestured toward the forest outside. "You want to leave?" I said. It nodded. I felt an unexpected pang. Loss, worry, a protectiveness, almost parental, that I had no right to feel toward a creature I had known for 72 hours. It was hurt. It was young. The temperature outside was still below 0. How could I just let it walk out the door? "Your ankle," I said, pointing at the wrapped joint. "It's not fully healed. Stay a few more days. Let it get stronger." The creature looked at its ankle, then at the door, then at me. It made a soft sound, low and resonant, that I had come to recognize as its way of expressing gentleness, gratitude maybe, or acknowledgement. Then it pointed at the forest again with more urgency. It touched its chest, then swept its hand outward towards the mountains, toward whatever home it had out there in the frozen wilderness. It had a family. I understood that suddenly and completely. Somewhere out in those mountains, there were others of its kind. Others who were probably frantic with worry, searching, calling out in whatever way they called to each other. This juvenile had been missing for 4 days. Its parents, if they had parents in the way I understood the concept, would be terrified. "Okay," I said, my voice rough. "Okay, but take this." I went to the kitchen and packed a paper grocery bag with everything I could spare. Apples, bread, canned meat, nuts, a jar of peanut butter. I brought it to the creature, who took it with both hands, looked inside, then looked at me. "For the trip," I said. "It's cold out there." The creature stood still for a long moment, holding the bag of food, staring at me with those honey gold eyes. Then it did something I did not expect. It reached out and touched my chest, right over my heart. Just one touch, brief and gentle, with the flat of its palm. Its hand covered nearly my entire chest, the warmth of its skin radiating through my flannel shirt. It held the touch for maybe 3 seconds, then pulled back. It reached for the door handle again, and this time worked it successfully, pulling the door open. A blast of frozen air rushed in, and the creature stepped out onto the porch. It looked back once, holding the bag of food against its chest, and then it moved. Despite the injured ankle, despite the cold, it crossed my yard and disappeared into the tree line in seconds, moving with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for something its size. I stood in the doorway watching the empty tree line for a long time, long enough that my ears went numb and my fingers ached. Then I closed the door, sat down in my chair by the wood stove, and tried to make sense of what had just happened to my life. I didn't tell anyone, not a single soul. I went back to work the next day, filed my patrol reports, restocked the elk feeding stations, answered radio calls, did my job, but nothing felt the same. I drove through those mountains with new eyes, scanning the tree lines, studying the snow for tracks that were too large and too human-shaped to be anything I could explain. I found them twice in the first week. Once along a ridge above the Clearwater, a line of massive footprints in the snow that appeared from nowhere and vanished into rock. Once near my own cabin, a single print in the frost at the edge of my yard, as if something had come close during the night, stood there for a moment, and then retreated. It was checking on me, or checking on the place where it had been safe. I wasn't sure which, and the distinction mattered more to me than I could articulate. 3 weeks passed. The cold snap broke slightly, temperatures climbing to the low 20s, which felt almost tropical after what we had endured. I had settled into a routine of obsessive documentation, recording everything I remembered about the creature in a journal I kept locked in my gun safe. Measurements, behaviors, vocalizations, the 15 gestures we had developed, the speed of its learning, the way it had healed. I drew sketches from memory, detailed illustrations of the hands, the feet, the face. I was a wildlife officer, not an artist, but the drawings were thorough and accurate. On January 29, 1978, I came home from a 12-hour patrol to find something on my porch. My headlights swept across the cabin as I pulled into the gravel drive, and I saw it immediately. Something sitting on the wooden planks in front of my door. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the Bronco, my hand instinctively going to the Smith & Wesson revolver on my hip. I approached slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. It was a bundle, a carefully constructed package wrapped in what I initially thought was bark, but quickly realized was a large piece of elk hide, scraped clean and folded with obvious deliberation. It had been placed precisely in the center of my porch, not tossed or dropped, but positioned with care. I knelt beside it and unwrapped the hide. Inside were 3 items. The first was a fish, a steelhead trout, fresh, maybe 4 pounds, still glistening. In January, in a river that was half frozen, catching a steelhead in those conditions would have required extraordinary skill even with human fishing equipment. This one showed no hook marks, no net abrasions. It had been caught by hand. The second item was a bundle of roots. I recognized some of them immediately. Camas root, a staple food of the Nez Perce people, nutritious and calorie-dense when roasted. Others I didn't recognize, but would later identify as wild ginger, and a species of tuber I had never seen in any botanical guide. The third item stopped my heart. It was a stone, flat, roughly oval, about the size of my palm, and on its surface, carved with crude but unmistakable intentionality, was an image. It showed 2 figures. One was large, standing upright, with long arms and a broad body. The other was smaller, lying horizontal, with lines around it that could have been water or ice. Between them, a line connected the 2 figures, a rope. The creature had carved a picture of me, saving it from the river. I sat on that frozen porch, holding that stone, and I wept. Not from sadness, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of what I was holding. This was art. This was narrative. This was a thinking being looking back at an experience and choosing to represent it symbolically, choosing to communicate a memory through a created image and deliver it to the person in that memory. This was not animal behavior. This was not instinct or imitation or learned response. This was a mind processing an event, assigning meaning to it, and expressing that meaning through creative representation. In the entire history of life on this planet, only one species had been confirmed to do this: humans. And now I was holding proof that there was another. I brought everything inside. I placed the fish in my freezer, the roots in a bowl on the counter, and the carved stone on my kitchen table, where I stared at it for the next 2 hours. My mind was racing through implications that kept multiplying the longer I thought. If this juvenile could carve a representational image, what could the adults do? If it had learned 15 gestural words from me in 3 days, how complex was its native communication system? If it had a concept of gratitude strong enough to motivate a return visit with gifts, what other emotions did it experience? What social structures supported those emotions? I was not a scientist. I was a game warden with a high school education and 5 years of field experience. But I understood enough to know that what I was holding could change the world. And I understood enough to be terrified of what the world would do with that knowledge. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my table, turning the stone in my hands, looking at the crude but clear image of a man and a creature and the line between them, and I tried to decide what to do. Report it to whom? My supervisor at Fish and Game would think I had lost my mind. The state police would send someone to evaluate my mental fitness. The media would turn me into either a sensation or a laughingstock. And the government, whatever agencies dealt with things like this, they would come for the creature. They would come with tranquilizer guns and cages and laboratory equipment, and that young being that had pressed its palm to my chest in gratitude would spend the rest of its life in a facility somewhere, studied and probed and never free again. I made my decision before sunrise. I would keep the secret. I would protect this creature and its kind by saying nothing to anyone. And I would learn everything I could, not to expose them, but to understand them. What I did not know that night, sitting alone in my cabin with a carved stone in my hands, was that this was only the beginning, that the juvenile would return, that it would bring others, that over the months and years that followed, I would be drawn into a relationship with a community of beings that would reveal to me things about their intelligence, their history, their grief, and their understanding of the world, that would make that carved stone look like a child's first scribble compared to a masterwork. And I did not know that the thing they eventually showed me, the place they eventually trusted me enough to reveal, would contain evidence of something so old and so profound that it would fundamentally alter what I believed about human history itself. But that was all ahead of me. That night, all I had was a stone, a fish, some roots, and the growing certainty that my life would never be the same. End part 1. The gifts kept coming. Every week or two through the rest of that winter, I would find something on my porch, always wrapped in hide or bark, always placed with that same deliberate care. Fish, roots, berries preserved in a way I didn't understand, dried and packed in cedar bark that kept them edible despite the cold, and always, always another carved stone. The carvings evolved rapidly. The first had been crude, a simple depiction of the rescue. The second, which arrived in mid-February, showed my cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and a figure standing in the doorway. The third showed a group of larger figures in what I interpreted as a forest setting, with one smaller figure at the edge, pointing towards something off the frame. The juvenile was telling its family about me, I was becoming part of their story. By March, the ice was thinning on the Clearwater, and the elk were moving back up to the higher meadows. I was deep into spring patrol preparations when something happened that accelerated everything. I was hiking a ridgeline trail about 4 miles from my cabin, checking for winter damage to a series of boundary markers, when I heard movement in the timber below me. Not elk, not deer. The footfalls were wrong, too heavy and too deliberate, with a rhythm that sounded like bipedal walking. I stopped and crouched behind a boulder, scanning the tree line with my binoculars, and there, moving through a stand of old-growth cedar, about 200 yards downhill, were 3 figures. One I recognized immediately by its size and the faint limp in its gait, the juvenile. But flanking it were 2 others, and the scale of them took my breath away. The larger of the 2 adults had to be over 8 feet tall, maybe 8.5. Its shoulders were wider than any doorframe I had ever seen, and it moved through the forest with a fluidity that belied its enormous mass. The hair was darker than the juvenile's, nearly black and longer around the shoulders and head. This was a male, a full-grown adult male, and the raw physical power radiating from its frame was something I could feel even from 200 yards away. The other adult was slightly smaller, maybe 7 feet, with reddish-brown hair and a build that was still massive, but somehow leaner, more proportional. A female, I guessed, based on the body structure and the way she moved in close proximity to the juvenile, one arm occasionally reaching out to guide or steady it. A mother's instinct, unmistakable in any species. They were heading toward my cabin. I started running, not away from them, but ahead of them, cutting through the forest on a path I knew by heart, racing to reach my property before they did. My mind was spinning with questions and fears. Were they coming to take back something I had? Were they angry about the juvenile's captivity, even though I hadn't held it captive? Were they territorial, aggressive? I reached my cabin about 10 minutes before they arrived. I was standing on my porch, breathing hard, sweat freezing on my forehead, when the tree line at the edge of my property parted and the juvenile walked into the open. It stopped when it saw me and made a sound I recognized, that gentle call of greeting or acknowledgement. Then it turned back toward the forest and made a different sound, louder, directed at the 2 adults still hidden in the shadows. It was calling them out, telling them it was safe. The female came first. She emerged from the trees slowly, every muscle taut with tension, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my throat dry. She was beautiful in a way I struggle to describe. Not human beauty, but older, wilder, a beauty that spoke of strength and a kind of ancient grace. She moved to stand beside the juvenile, one arm pulling it close in a motion that was pure maternal instinct. Then the male came out, and I understood, truly understood for the first time, what these creatures were capable of. If that male had decided I was a threat, there would have been nothing I could do about it. My Smith & Wesson revolver might as well have been a water pistol. He was the most formidable living thing I had ever seen, a wall of muscle and intelligence and coiled potential that made every predator I had ever encountered seem small and manageable by comparison. But he didn't attack. He walked into my yard and stopped about 30 feet away. He looked at me. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the porch where the juvenile had been leaving its gifts. And then he did something that the juvenile had done that last morning before it left. He placed his hand flat against his own chest, over his heart, and extended it toward me, palm out. The female did the same, and behind them, the juvenile made a sound that was almost like a chirp, excited and pleased. They were thanking me. The parents had come to thank me for saving their child. I returned the motion without thinking, placing my hand over my heart and extending it. It felt right. It felt like the only possible response. My eyes were stinging, and I had to blink hard to keep my vision clear. The male took 2 more steps forward. He was close enough now that I could have reached out and touched him, Though I kept my hands at my sides, he smelled like the forest itself, like cedar and damp earth and a muskier scent, one that was uniquely his own. His eyes were darker than the juvenile's, a deep brown that was almost black, and they studied me with a depth of assessment that felt like being read, not just observed, read, like a book being opened and examined page by page. Then he spoke. Not in English, obviously, in a series of vocalizations that were lower and more complex than anything the juvenile had produced. Tonal shifts, rhythmic patterns, consonant-like stops made deep in the throat. It was language, not human language, not anything I could replicate, but structured communication with syntax and variation that made me certain he was saying something specific, not just making noise. "I don't understand," I said, "but I want to." He regarded me for another long moment. Then he turned to the female and made a brief utterance. She responded. They were discussing something, deliberating. The juvenile watched them with the anxious attention of a child waiting for a verdict. The male turned back to me. He pointed at himself, then swept his arm in a wide arc encompassing the mountains, the forest, the sky. He pointed at me, then at my cabin, then at the ground beneath my feet. Then he pointed at his chest and at mine, and brought his hands together, interlocking his massive fingers. I interpreted it as simply as I could. "You are of the mountains. I am of this place. We are connected." He nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. They stayed for perhaps 20 minutes. The female eventually relaxed enough to sit on a log at the edge of my yard, while the juvenile explored the area around the cabin with obvious familiarity. The male remained standing, watchful but not aggressive, occasionally exchanging sounds with the female that I tried to memorize for later documentation. Before they left, the female approached me alone. She was gentler in her movements than the male, more cautious but also more expressive. She reached into a pouch-like fold in the longer hair at her hip, something I hadn't noticed before, a natural pocket formed by the way the fur grew, and pulled out a small object. She held it out to me. It was another carved stone, but this one was different from the juvenile's work. The craftsmanship was markedly more sophisticated. The image showed a large figure and a small figure sitting together, the small one's leg wrapped in lines that clearly represented bandages. Above them, carved with remarkable precision, was a circle with lines radiating from it. A sun, or perhaps a symbol for warmth, for safety. She had carved the scene as she imagined it. Her child, injured and afraid, being cared for by a human, and she was giving me that image as a gift, as a testament, as proof that she knew what I had done and that it meant something to her beyond what any sign could convey. "Thank you," I said, and the inadequacy of those two words in that moment was almost physically painful. They left together, the three of them, disappearing into the forest with a silence that still amazes me when I think about it. Three beings of extraordinary size, moving through dense timber without snapping a single branch, like smoke, like shadows given form and then dissolved again. That evening I sat at my table with both carved stones in front of me, the juvenile's rough rendering beside the mother's skilled work. I was looking at two pieces of art created by two different individuals of the same species, showing different levels of ability and different perspectives on the same event. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just tool use or symbolic thinking. This was culture. This was artistic tradition being passed from generation to generation. The mother's skill hadn't appeared from nowhere. She had learned from someone, practiced, refined her technique over years, which meant there were others who carved, others who taught, a lineage of knowledge stretching back who knew how far. Over the next several months, the visits became regular, not on any schedule I could predict, but approximately every 2 to 3 weeks. The juvenile would appear at the edge of my property, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or both parents. I started leaving food out for them, large quantities of fruit, vegetables, and dried meat that I would place on a flat rock about 50 yards from my cabin. The food was always gone by morning, and in its place I would find gifts, more carved stones, bundles of medicinal roots. Once, a perfectly woven length of cord made from plant fibers, strong enough to support my weight when I tested it. I began to think of the juvenile as cedar because of its habit of stripping bark from cedar trees and chewing it the way a human teenager chews gum. The male I called Ridge, for the pronounced sagittal crest at the top of his skull. The female was Willow, for the grace of her movements and the way she would sometimes sit by the creek on my property, with a stillness that reminded me of a willow tree reflected in water. By the summer of 1978, Cedar was comfortable enough to come within arm's reach of me again. Our gestural vocabulary had expanded to perhaps 40 or 50 concepts. I could ask simple questions and receive answers. Are you hungry? Are the others nearby? Is there danger? And Cedar could initiate conversations of its own, pointing at objects and looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to provide the human word. It was building a vocabulary, not of spoken language, but of understood language. Cedar was learning to comprehend English while communicating through gesture and vocalization. Ridge and Willow maintained more distance, but their trust grew. Ridge would sit at the edge of the clearing while Cedar and I interacted, watching with an expression I came to recognize as paternal concern mixed with something like curiosity. He wanted to understand what his child was learning. Willow would sometimes join the gestural exchanges, her carved stones becoming increasingly complex and detailed. She was documenting our interactions through art, creating a visual record that served both as communication and as something I can only call memoir. In September of that year, something changed. Cedar arrived at my cabin one evening with obvious agitation. It paced back and forth, making distressed sounds, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the forest. Something was wrong. I followed, grabbing my flashlight and my first aid kit out of instinct. Cedar led me through the forest for perhaps half a mile, moving quickly despite the deepening darkness. We crossed a shallow part of the creek and climbed a ridge I had never hiked before, entering a section of old growth that was so dense the canopy blocked even the moonlight. Ridge was waiting at the base of a massive Douglas fir. He was crouching, which was unusual. He was always standing, always tall, always that imposing wall of presence. Crouching meant something was wrong. He looked at me when I approached, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized from my years of wildlife work. Helplessness. The look of a parent who cannot fix what is broken. He moved aside and I saw Willow. She was lying on the ground, breathing rapidly, her face contorted in what was clearly severe pain. Her right arm was held against her body at an angle that immediately told me something. The forearm was broken, not a clean break either. I could see the deformity through the fur, the way the bone had shifted out of alignment. How? I asked, though I knew no one could answer me. Cedar made a series of rapid sounds while gesturing, and though I couldn't understand everything, I gathered that Willow had fallen. From a height, maybe from a cliff face or a tree. The broken arm was the result. I knelt beside her and she flinched, pulling away. The pain made her defensive, made her instincts override the trust we had built. Ridge made a low, steady sound from behind me, something like reassurance directed at Willow. She stilled, her breathing ragged, her eyes fixed on me with a combination of fear and desperate hope. I need to set this, I said, more to myself than to them. If the bone heals out of alignment, she could lose the use of the arm. I've done this with injured animals, never with anything like her, but the principle is the same. I had set bones on elk calves, on a young wolf that had been hit by a truck and survived, once on a deputy sheriff who broke his wrist in a fall during a backcountry search. I was not a doctor. I was not qualified for what I was about to do, but I was all they had. I fashioned a splint from 2 straight branches I cut with my knife, padding them with strips torn from my undershirt. I had her bite down on a thick piece of leather from my belt sheath, the same way frontier doctors used to give patients something to clamp onto during surgery. Then, with Ridge steadying her shoulders and Cedar holding her uninjured hand, I set the bone. The sound she made went through me like a blade, a guttural cry of agony that echoed off the trees and sent birds scattering from the canopy above. But she didn't strike me, didn't push me away. She endured it with a strength that left me humbled. And when it was over, when the bone was realigned and the splint was bound tight with strips of cloth and plant fiber cord, she lay back panting, sweat soaking her fur, trembling. Ridge pressed his face against hers. Not a nuzzle. Closer to what a human would call putting foreheads together. An intimate act of comfort and connection. Cedar curled up against her uninjured side, making soft sounds that could only be a child trying to comfort a parent. I sat back in the dirt, my hands shaking, my shirt gone, my undershirt shredded for bandages, the September mountain air cold against my bare arms. I had just performed field surgery on a Sasquatch. My life had officially exceeded any framework I had for understanding it. The arm healed well. By mid-October, Willow could move her fingers again, and by November, she was using the arm for light tasks. She gave me an etched stone the day the splint came off. It showed a figure reaching toward another figure's arm, and it was the most detailed carving she had ever given me. Every line was precise. The emotion in the postures of the 2 figures was palpable even in stone. That autumn, as Willow recovered and the forests turned gold and crimson around us, Cedar did something that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. It brought me to the others. I need to be careful in how I describe this, because even now, 47 years later, I am protective of what I witnessed and where it occurred. I will not give specific coordinates. I will not name exact landmarks. The location matters less than what was there. Cedar led me on a hike that lasted most of a day. We left before dawn and walked steadily northeast into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, crossing terrain that grew increasingly rugged and remote. Ridge and Willow did not come. This was Cedar's decision, Cedar's invitation. I believe the juvenile had argued for this, had made the case to its parents that I could be trusted with what it wanted to show me, and they had agreed, reluctantly. We climbed above the tree line, traversed a knife-edge ridge that had my heart in my throat, then descended into a valley that was completely hidden from any trail or road I knew of. The valley was small, maybe half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, sheltered on all sides by granite walls that rose hundreds of feet. A stream ran through its center, fed by snowmelt and natural springs, and the valley floor was lush with old-growth timber and meadow grasses despite the elevation. A microclimate, warm and protected, invisible from the outside world. They were there, not just Cedar's family, others. I counted 11 individuals, 4 adult males, 3 adult females, 2 adolescents older than Cedar, and 2 very young ones, infants or toddlers that clung to the adult females with tiny hands. 11 Sasquatch, living in a hidden valley in the Idaho wilderness, and I was the first human to see them. The reaction to my arrival was intense. Several of the adults moved immediately into defensive postures, the males stepping forward, the females pulling the young ones behind them. Vocalizations erupted loud and urgent, a chorus of alarm that echoed off the valley walls. One of the larger males, bigger even than Ridge, took 3 steps toward me with an expression that was openly hostile. Cedar stepped between us. The juvenile raised both hands, palms out, and made a long, complex call directed at the group. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. "Trust me, he's safe. I vouch for him." The hostile male stopped but didn't retreat. He stared at me over Cedar's head with eyes that were calculating, measuring, deciding whether to accept this juvenile's judgment or override it with his own. What followed was the most terrifying and extraordinary negotiation I have ever witnessed. Cedar spoke to the group for what felt like an hour but was probably 15 minutes. It gestured toward me, touched its ankle where the injury had been, made the hand-over-heart gesture, and produced sounds that rose and fell with the cadence of storytelling. It was telling them what had happened. The river, the rescue, my cabin, the healing, the food, the communication, the carved stones. It was presenting my credentials to an audience that would decide my fate. Other members of the group responded. Some sounded skeptical. Some sounded curious. The large hostile male made several sharp interjections that sounded like objections. But an older female, smaller than the others, with silver gray hair and clouded eyes that suggested cataracts, made a long, quiet statement that seemed to settle everything. When she finished, the group visibly relaxed. The hostile male stepped back, not happy about it but deferring to whatever the elder had said. Cedar turned to me with an expression of visible relief and made our sign for welcome. I spent 3 days in that valley. Their community was structured around the elder female, whom I came to think of as grandmother. She was the oldest member of the group, probably in her 60s or 70s. Her authority was absolute but not enforced through strength. It was respected because of her knowledge, her memory, her judgment. They had names for each other, not names in the human sense, but unique calls that identified specific individuals. Each member of the group had a distinct call that functioned exactly like a name. These weren't random. They were consistent and specific and recognized by every member of the community. They had customs. Mealtime was communal. Sleeping arrangements followed a pattern based on family units. There were behaviors that could only be called etiquette, ways of greeting each other after absence, ways of deferring to the elder, ways of interacting with the young that were gentle and instructional. I watched an adult male spend an hour teaching one of the adolescents how to strip bark from a specific tree, demonstrating the technique with patience that rivaled any human teacher I had ever seen. And they had memory. On my second day, the elder approached me. She reached into a natural pouch in her fur and pulled out a collection of carved stones. She spread them on the ground in front of me. There were dozens. Some were old, the carved surfaces worn smooth by years of handling. Some were more recent, and as I looked at them, I realized I was looking at a record, a history. The stones told stories. One showed figures being pursued by smaller figures carrying long, straight objects, spears or guns. Another showed a large figure lying still while smaller figures stood over it. Death, killing. Another showed a group of large figures moving through mountains, a migration or a flight. And the oldest stones, the ones so worn I could barely make out the images, showed something that made my hands tremble. They showed large figures and small figures together, cooperating, standing side by side, sharing food. The oldest stones depicted a time when Sasquatch and humans had coexisted, had lived alongside each other with mutual awareness and mutual respect. The elder watched me examine each stone. When I reached the ones showing violence, she made a sound that needed no translation. Grief. Old grief. The kind that becomes part of you, woven into your bones so deeply you can't separate it from who you are. She picked up the oldest stone, the one showing the two species together, and held it up. Then she picked up the most recent one, showing a figure alone, hiding, afraid. She placed them side by side and looked at me. This is what was, and this is what is. You did this. This is, your kind did this to us. The third day, the elder showed me something else. She led me to a cave at the far end of the valley, partially hidden by a waterfall. Inside, the cave walls were covered with carvings, not small portable stones, but the rock face itself, carved with images that extended from floor to ceiling and continued deeper into the cave than my flashlight could reach. The images were organized chronologically. The oldest carvings at the deepest part of the cave showed a world teeming with large figures, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They showed hunting scenes, gathering, what appeared to be ceremonies. As the carvings progressed toward the cave entrance, the number of figures decreased. Smaller figures appeared, humans. At first, the two groups mingled. Then they separated. Then the smaller figures began carrying weapons. Then the large figures began disappearing from the images entirely, replaced by scenes of flight, hiding, isolation, loss. The most recent carvings near the cave entrance showed small clusters of large figures hidden in mountains, separated from each other, diminishing. The final image showed a single figure standing alone in a vast, empty landscape. I was looking at a species autobiography, a visual history spanning what I estimated could be thousands of years, documenting the slow, terrible decline of a people from abundance to near extinction. I left the valley on the morning of the fourth day. Before we parted, I crouched down to Cedar's eye level and placed my hand over my heart. "I will protect you," I said, "all of you, for as long as I live." Cedar mirrored the gesture. Then it pulled out one final stone etching. This one showed the valley, the surrounding mountains, the stream, and the group of figures living there. But at the edge of the image, facing the valley, was a single, smaller figure. Me, standing guard. The years that followed tested that promise in ways I could never have anticipated. I restructured my entire career around protecting that valley. I volunteered for the most remote patrol assignments. I quietly sabotaged 2 proposed logging roads that would have brought heavy equipment within 5 miles of the valley. I redirected hunting parties away from areas where I knew the group traveled. In 1982, the biggest threat came from the United States Forest Service itself. A survey team was commissioned to assess mineral deposits as part of a Reagan-era push to open federal lands to mining interests. Their proposed route would have taken them directly through the valley. I spent 6 weeks crafting a report documenting a fictitious population of endangered Idaho ground squirrels in the area, complete with fabricated sighting records and habitat assessments. The report was sufficient to redirect the survey team 8 miles south. It was illegal. It was a falsification of government wildlife data. And I would do it again without hesitation. Through the 80s, I watched Cedar grow from a gangly juvenile into a powerful young adult. The community in the valley shifted and changed the way all communities do, with births and losses and the slow turning of generations. Grandmother died in 1991. She passed quietly in the valley, surrounded by her community, and was buried in a ceremony that lasted an entire day. They dug a grave with their hands, lined it with cedar boughs, and placed her body inside with her carved stones arranged around her. Every member of the community made a sound that I can only describe as an elegy. The calls filled the valley like music, like a choir, performing a requiem in a language older than any human tongue. I stood at the edge, uninvited but unquestioned. When the burial was complete, I placed my own offering on the mound. The carved stone she had given me that first day, the one showing 2 species living together. I buried it with her because it belonged to her story. 2 years later, life reasserted itself in the way it always does. Cedar found a mate, and in the spring of 1993, Cedar's mate gave birth to a daughter. I was there, waiting in the trees at a respectful distance, close enough that Cedar found me afterward and brought me to see the infant. The baby was tiny, smaller than a human newborn, with a cap of fine golden brown fur and eyes whose lids flickered with the dreaming of something new and full of possibility. Cedar held the infant up with an expression of such pride and tenderness that it dissolved any remaining barrier between us. I brought a gift, a blanket, soft flannel, red plaid. Cedar's mate wrapped the infant in it. For months, every time I saw the baby, it was swaddled in that flannel blanket. The image of a baby Sasquatch wrapped in red plaid flannel is one of the most beautiful things I carry with me. By the time I retired from Fish and Game in 2003, I could hold something resembling a conversation with Cedar. Not in words, never in words, but in meaning. I retired at 54 because new department policies required GPS tracking of all patrol vehicles, and I could no longer account for my hours in Sasquatch territory without raising questions. In 2015, Cedar brought me one final gift that eclipsed everything before. It was autumn. Cedar met me at the usual spot and indicated it wanted me to follow. This time there was something different in Cedar's demeanor, a solemnity, a weight. We hiked for several hours, not toward the valley, but south into a section of the wilderness I had rarely visited. We reached a plateau where the trees were ancient, some of the largest I had ever seen. Cedar stopped at the base of the largest tree, a Douglas fir that must have been 600 years old. It knelt and began clearing debris from between the massive roots. Beneath the dirt and centuries of forest litter, there was a flat stone surface. Cedar swept it clean, revealing a rock face that had been buried and forgotten. And on that surface were carvings. These were ancient. The lines were deep but weathered, softened by ages of exposure before the forest floor had covered them, and the images they contained were on a scale I had never imagined. They showed a world, a complete world. Mountains, rivers, forests, plains, and across all of it, figures, large figures, thousands. The carvings depicted a civilization of beings who lived in organized communities, who hunted cooperatively, who gathered in great numbers for ceremonies or councils. The scope suggested a population that had once spanned the entire continent, and among those figures, interspersed but distinct, were smaller figures, humans, living with them, working alongside them. The two species in this ancient record were not separate. They were not enemies, they were partners. Cedar placed its hand flat on the stone on one of the images showing the two species together. Then it placed its other hand over its heart. Then it touched my chest. We were one people. Once, long ago, before everything went wrong. I sat on that plateau for hours, tracing lines of carvings that predated any written human history I knew of. This record was ancient in a way that made human timelines feel brief and uncertain. That was nearly 10 years ago now. I am 76 years old. My knees ache in the cold. My eyes aren't what they were. I make the hike to the valley less often than I used to. Cedar is old too. The silver has spread from its face across its shoulders and down its back. We sit together sometimes by the stream in the valley, two old creatures watching the water and the young ones playing at the edge of the meadow. And there is a communion in that silence that I have never found with another human being. I never married, never had children of my own. People in Orofino thought I was a hermit, an eccentric old game warden who preferred trees to people. They weren't entirely wrong, but they didn't know the real reason. I had a family. They just weren't human. I am telling this story now because I am running out of time, not because I am ill, but because the world is closing in. Satellite imaging grows more precise every year. Drone technology has made even the most remote wilderness accessible. Climate change is pushing the group to higher elevations, shrinking the habitat that sustains them, and the valley is no longer as hidden as it was. Last spring, I found a trail camera mounted on a tree less than 2 miles from the valley entrance. It belonged to a wildlife photographer, harmless in intent, perhaps, but terrifying in implication. I don't want fame from this story. I don't want money or recognition. I want one thing. I want the world to know that these beings are real, that they are intelligent, that they have a culture and a history and a capacity for love and grief and art that equals anything humanity has produced. And I want the world to leave them alone. They have been watching us for longer than we can comprehend. They have carved the story of our shared history into stone and carried it with them through millennia of retreat and diminishment. They remember a time when we lived together. They mourn the loss of that time with a depth of sorrow that I have spent 47 years learning to recognize and that I still do not fully understand. The carved stone that Cedar brought me that day in January of 1978, the one showing the rescue from the river, sits on my mantle. I look at it every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep. It is the most important object I have ever possessed, not because of what it shows, but because of what it represents. A hand reaching across the divide between species, a child's gratitude expressed in stone, the beginning of a trust that would reshape my understanding of what it means to be alive on this planet. I pulled a juvenile Bigfoot out of a frozen river 47 years ago, and what it brought me, what it taught me, what it gave me across nearly half a century of impossible friendship, was proof that we are not alone, that we never were, that the forests hold a people as old as the mountains themselves, a people who remember us, who once trusted us, and who might trust us again if we can find it in ourselves to deserve it. That is what Cedar changed, not just what I knew about them, what I knew about us, about what we owe to the world we share, about the debt we carry for the silence we imposed on a people who only wanted to be left in peace. I still leave apples on the flat rock by my cabin, and they are still gone every morning, and sometimes in the gray light before dawn, I see a figure at the tree line, silver-haired and stooped but still standing, still watching, still trusting. And I place my hand over my heart, the way a juvenile once taught me in a warm cabin on a frozen January morning. And across 50 yards of snow-covered yard, the figure does the same. Some things don't need words. Some connections survive despite everything that should have broken them. And some promises, once made in the desperate grip of a rope stretched across cracking ice, last forever.